Welcome everybody to the 2024 Thandika Mkandawire Memorial Lecture. Our chair is Dr. Godwin Murunga. Dr. Murunga is the Executive Secretary of the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRIA, based in Dakar, Senegal. The CODESRIA is a co-sponsor of the annual Thandika Mkandawire Memorial Lecture. So I'll hand over to Dr. Murunga from now on as the chair of the session. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Murunga.
Thank you very much, Professor Jimi Adesina. Thank you all for joining us this morning in some places, mid-morning in other places, afternoon, and actually evening in other places also, for this edition of the annual Thandika Mkandawire Memorial Lecture. Before I proceed, I just want to let everyone who is online know that this lecture is being translated into either French or English, depending on the person speaking. So you should feel free to go back onto your system. And if you're more comfortable listening to the French version, there is interpretation being provided. And if you feel more comfortable in English, you can either use the original sound or you can log on to the English line so that you can listen to the interventions in English. We thought that interpretation would provide us with a wider latitude to bring in people who might not speak or might not be proficient in English. So please feel welcome to go to the language interpretation button and you can navigate your way into the language that works for you. So to start off, my name is Godwin Murunga. I'm the Executive Secretary of CODESRIA, a co-sponsor for the series of lectures that we've had around the legacy of the late Mwalimu Thandika Mkandawire. This 2024 edition is the third in the series that we've had, and the lectures have been a joint initiative between the SARChI chair in social policy at the University of South Africa, for which Professor Jimi Adesina is our lead, UNRISD in Geneva, for which I know that there is a transition happening now, but I believe that Ilcheong is today representing UNRISD. And I know that Katja, who is the current acting director, is away. And of course, CODESRIA, the three of us, three institutions came together to start the annual Thandika Mkandawire Memorial Lecture. And I can say that the experience we've had over the last series of lectures we've had has enabled the three institutions to grow into a formidable partnership that so far has counted nearly enough milestones. And so just to begin by thanking both UNRISD and the SARChI chair for allowing CODESRIA to be a collaborator in this initiative. I am certainly convinced that this initiative carries nearly enough potential for us to believe that there is room for greater optimism, that the annual Thandika Mkandawire Memorial Lecture will grow into something that does contribute not just to knowledge around issues of social policy, but to knowledge generally in the social sciences and beyond. Part of the reason for the optimism is indeed the legacy of the late Mwalimu Thandika Mkandawire. His contribution did not look as immense when he was alive. But after he passed on, CODESRIA established an archive on its website where we collected both his contribution in audio and written. And it's an archive that continues to grow every day as we encounter some of the issues that Thandika Mkandawire grappled with over his time as a scholar. He was not just a leading scholar, he was himself an institution builder in many senses of the word. I think those of us who are joining in today and who are aware of his contribution to CODESRIA will agree that he found CODESRIA at a particular moment in time after Professor Abdallah Bujra left as executive secretary and took it to a new level, so that by the time he left in 1996, it was clear that CODESRIA had occupied its place on the map, not just in Africa, but across the world. He was a teacher to many of us. We learned from him directly and occasionally indirectly. Anyone who had an opportunity to meet him felt not just learning many things, but also felt that there was a mentor sitting there. And not only was his influence in CODESRIA, he did in fact define and redefine the trajectory of intellectual contribution at UNRISD when he took over the leadership of UNRISD. I eventually ended up at the London School of Economics, where he established, at least was able to carve a path for the study of Africa around issues of political economy. And I know that he celebrated in all these institutions. Many of us who know him obviously do miss him a lot. And it is indeed a testament to his legacy that not only do we continue to run this series of lectures through this particular initiative, but that other institutions are actually also doing the same. I am aware that London School of Economics has a lecture in his honor, which I think would be happening around the same time. But next month, I am also aware that one of our colleagues, young colleagues, Grieve Chelwa, is organizing a conference titled Directions in African Political Economy. And that conference is a conference in honor of the late Professor Thandika Mkandawire. I think it will be convening at the Africa Institute in Sharjah from the 14th to the 16th of November. And many colleagues who have agreed to be there are looking forward to this. And I know that this is a testimony to the legacy that Mwalimu Thandika Mkandawire did bring to the table. As I said, this will be the third in the series of lectures that we've had in honor of Professor Thandika Mkandawire. The first one was delivered by Professor Fantu Sheru in 2021. And the text of the lecture is available in Africa Development, which is the premier CODESRIA journal, volume 47, number 2 of 2022. The second lecture was delivered by Fiona Trigana in 2022. And the text of the lecture is published in Africa Development, volume 48, number 2 of 2023. We had planned to have the third lecture in the series in December 2023 to coincide with the celebration of the 50th anniversary of CODESRIA. But for reasons beyond our control, we were unable to have it at the General Assembly. And so the lecture that we are about to attend is the third in the series of lectures that we have had in honor of Mwalimu Thandika Mkandawire. I would like to conclude my word of welcome by mentioning perhaps what I feel is a very important point, and it is that the series of lectures that we are attending began after a major conference that the SARChI chair, again in partnership with CODESRIA and UNRISD, organized in Pretoria sometime in the last quarter of 2018, I believe. In that conference, Thandika Mkandawire was one of the keynote speakers. But coincidentally, also Professor Tade Aina was one of the other keynote speakers at that conference. And that conference has continued. I think this year in March, we had the third or fourth in the series of conferences that the chair in collaboration with CODESRIA and UNRISD have been organizing. I say this to make the point that Professor Tade Aina is someone who is very familiar with the journey of CODESRIA. Not only did he serve as a Deputy Executive Secretary at CODESRIA in charge of publications, but that he has remained perhaps one of the people who has supported the council in ways that the rest of the world does not know. Personally, I'm very grateful that Professor Aina agreed to give this keynote because this is my last year as Executive Secretary of CODESRIA. And the first time I went to CODESRIA, Professor Tade Aina was the Deputy Executive Secretary in charge of publications. And the levels of mentorship then in 1997, the camaraderie that we enjoyed when we were young scholars, the encouragement that we enjoyed at the time is something that continues to inspire and encourage us to do the work that we do. And so a personal word of thank you to Professor Aina for agreeing to join us to deliver this particular lecture. You have been very supportive to CODESRIA. You have contributed immensely in the field of higher education. It is indeed interesting that you are back at Carnegie Corporation of New York, again, leading the higher education program. And I am aware that there's going to be a formal introduction of you, but as Executive Secretary of CODESRIA, I want to put on record my word of gratitude for the contribution that we have all enjoyed through your work, through your publications, through your mentorship, and through your friendship. So I want to hand over to Professor Jimi Adesina to proceed with the rest of the welcoming address, the introduction and all that. And to thank all of you again for honoring us with your presence online for the 2014 annual Thandika Mkandawire Memorial Lecture. Professor Aina, please.
Thank you, Godwin. This is a brief welcome remark. Professor Thandika Mkandawire passed away on 27th March 2020. He was chair of Africa Development at the London School of Economics. Before then, he was at various times the director of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, UNRISD, and the executive secretary of the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRIA. Although trained as an economist, Mkandawire was intensely interdisciplinary, bringing a distinct sociological sensibility to development economics in the tradition of Gunnar Myrdal. Professor Mkandawire was part of the corps of African post-colonial intellectuals with a fierce commitment to the imperative of the continent charting its own development path and intellectual autonomy. Against the clamor of the demise of development, Mkandawire made a distinction between the Truman and the Bandung Conference versions of post-World War II development discourse. The latter, Mkandawire insisted, is an emancipatory project. While the international development community may be mad in development as moral premise for helping distant strangers, as Thandika once put it, and its inherent paternalism for Africa, the Bandung Conference version was imperative. For Mkandawire, development as growth with structural transformation of the economy and society, and the mastery of technology involved two substantive elements. The first relates to knowledge. Catching up, Mkandawire argued, requires, I quote, that countries know themselves and their history that has set the initial conditions for their future programs, end of quote. Development requires learning from pioneers, but is not mimicry. The knowledge imperative requires a considerable investment in institutions of knowledge production and state capacity. And that speaks to the theme of today's memorial lecture. Second, African states not only have to be developmental, but they also have to be democratic and inclusive. Developmental in the sense of managing economies, quote, in a manner that maximizes economic growth, induces structural change, and uses all available resources in a responsible and sustainable manner in highly competitive global conditions. End of quote. And democratic in the sense of deliberative governance, a respect for people's rights, and socially inclusive in providing all citizens with a decent living. Democracy and inclusivity are not merely the ends of development, but the means as well. A corollary is the idea of transformative social policy, that enhances people's productive capacity, protects against the vagaries of life and the market, is redistributive, ensures the equitable allocation of social reproduction roles, and enhances social cohesion. Social policy is a means and an end of development. Mkandawire generously gave his time to mentoring younger scholars and facilitating their careers. Remarkable is in his institution building. He combined an overflowing sense of humor with personal integrity and inclusive engagement. The annual memorial lecture is our way of honoring Professor Mkandawire's memory and celebrating his legacy. Professor Fantu Cheru delivered the inaugural memorial lecture, followed in 2022 by Professor Fiona Tregana. Today, we are honored to have Professor Tade Akin deliver this year's memorial lecture. And by the way, today is the 84th posthumous birthday anniversary of Professor Mkandawire. He will have been 84 years old today. We continue to celebrate his memory and legacy and wish him well as he looks down on us from the realm of the ancestors. Happy birthday, Mwalimu. On behalf of the South African Research Chair in Social Policy and the University of South Africa, I welcome you to the 2024 Thandika Mkandawire Memorial Lecture Program. Thank you.
I think that Prof. Jimi Adesina, you can proceed with the. We have a recording for UNRISD.
Yes.
Please.
A warm welcome to all who meet online today to listen to the Thandika Mkandawire Memorial Lecture 2024. My name is Katja Hujo, and I'm currently Acting Director of UNRISD, the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. UNRISD is an independent research institute in the UN, working on themes such as social policy, gender, alternative economies, and climate justice. Thandika was director of UNRISD from 1998 until his retirement from the UN in 2009. I joined the institute under his leadership and was privileged to work with this outstanding personality, scholar, and thinker. It is my pleasure to co-host this annual lecture with the South African Research Chair in Social Policy, led by Jimi Adesina, and the Council for the Development of Social Sciences, Research in Africa, CODESRIA, represented by its Executive Secretary, Dr. Godwin Murunga. The three institutions hosting this event all have deep connections with and a profound appreciation of Thandika. He has shaped and inspired our work. He has provided us with an interdisciplinary methodology to analyze development in the South, bringing together the literature of development economics, social policy, and democratization. He has reminded us to not forget history and colonial legacies, but not to be bound to them. He sought answers for the young African nations that are context-specific and addressed the social question and the developmental question, and he emphasized the importance of institutions. Thandika joined UNRISD 3 years after the Social Summit in Copenhagen in 1995, a summit that had allowed critical voices to surface, those that highlighted the destructive consequences of stabilization, structural adjustment, and austerity policies. Countless personal lives at the time were at risk and entire economies devastated. UNRISD published several important reports around that time, pointing towards the challenges of neoliberal globalization, the dismantling of public institutions, the lack of sustainable finance and rising debt, and the resilient approach to social policy. At this moment, 1 year before the Second World Social Summit, which will be convened in Qatar in 2025, the world is again in a dire situation, with ever-rising inequalities, environmental destruction, rising poverty, and war. Many SDGs are off track, authoritarian and populist leaders are on the rise, and the multilateral system is questioned. It is high time to think about social development and to think about those institutions that really matter to people's lives. Decent work, education, health, pensions, public transport, access to energy, clean water, a healthy environment, affordable housing, access to public spaces, support for families, culture and arts, respect of human rights and labor organizations. The list could go on. We need to remind policymakers of what matters to us and rebuild the social contract, including a contract for nature, what UNRISD calls an eco-social contract. Today's lecture by Professor Tade, Akin, Aina on vision, value and values in the transformation of higher education in Africa, opportunities and challenges, is an excellent contribution to this debate that we need to start now. Thandika used to emphasize the need for systems building in education and health provision. He disagreed with the focus on primary education as sufficient for low-income countries, reminding us that investing in a qualified workforce is the only way to create quality services and higher value-added production. Higher education educates citizens, while catering institutions and the economy with professionals, professors, doctors, engineers, accountants, etc. I know that you are already looking forward to Professor Tade's lecture, and I would very much like to be there to listen. I wish you all an inspiring lecture and send you greetings from Geneva. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jimi Adesina, please.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Tade Akin, the keynote speaker for today's event, the 2024 Thandika Mkandawire Memorial Lecture. Professor Aina is Senior Program Director of Higher Education and Research in Africa program at the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Previously, he was Chief Impact and Research Officer at the MasterCard Foundation, working enterprise-wide across 7 African countries, 3 programming streams, and Canada to co-produce strategic and program-supported research, evaluations, and reviews along with knowledge mobilization and products. From 2020 to 2022, he was the head of research at the MasterCard Foundation and later Senior Director of Research and Learning from 2022 to 2023. He was Executive Director of the Partnership for African Social and Governance Research, PASGA, Kenya, from 2014 to 2020. PASGA is an independent, non-partisan, Pan-African not-for-profit organization established in 2011 and located in Nairobi, Kenya. From 2008 to 2014, Professor Aina was Program Director of Higher Education and Libraries in Africa for the Carnegie Corporation of New York. From 1998 to 2008, Professor Aina worked in various capacities at the Ford Foundation office in Nairobi, serving as program officer and regional representative of the Ford Foundation office for Eastern Africa from 2003 to 2008. For a short period between 2001 and 2002, he served as acting representative at the Ford Foundation office in Cairo. From 1993 to 1998, Professor Aina served as a Deputy Executive Secretary Publications at the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRIA, as Dr. Murunga earlier indicated to us. Between 1993 and 1996, he served under Thandika Mkandawire, who was the Executive Secretary of CODESRIA. While at CODESRIA, Professor Aina led the multinational research project on globalization and social policy in Africa. Before joining CODESRIA, Professor Aina was an academic at the Department of Sociology, University of Lagos, Nigeria, rising from graduate assistant in 1975 to a lecturer in 1980, to senior lecturer in 1984, and full professor of sociology in 1993. During his time as an academic at the University of Lagos, Professor Aina also served as Deputy National Coordinator of the Nigerian Environmental Action and Study Team and Project Director and Team Leader for the Environment Problems of Lagos project. The project was funded by Swedish International Development Agency and the International Institute for Environment and Development. Professor Aina continues to serve as a member of the following bodies: the University Council of the University of the United States International University Africa in Nairobi, Board of Directors African Population Health Research Center in Nairobi, Board of Directors of Trust Africa in Dakar, Senegal, Board of Directors Winrock International, Arlington, United States, and Board of Directors Kenya Human Rights Commission. In April 2023, Professor Aina was awarded an LLD honoris causa degree by the University of Ghana, Legon, for his contribution to African higher education. In August 2024, he received the Lifetime Achievement Award in African Philanthropy at the 5th African Philanthropy Conference in Victoria Falls, Zimbabwe. It is with great pleasure that I invite Professor Tade Akin to deliver the 2024 Thandika Mkandawire Memorial Lecture. Over to you, Professor Tade Akin.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Greetings, everybody, wherever you might be in the world today. I hope you can hear me all. Thank you very much, Professor Jimi Adesina. I'd like to begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to the organizers of this event, namely the three key institutions: CODESRIA, represented by our Executive Secretary, Dr. Godwin Murunga, the SARChI Chair in Social Policy, Professor Jimi Adesina, one of my co-travelers on the long journey of making sense of transformative social policy in Africa, and UNRISD, represented by its acting director, Dr. Katja, Hujo, for giving me the opportunity to deliver the third Thandika Mkandawire Memorial Lecture. For me, it's a very special event, particularly considering that today is Thandika's birthday also. I had the privilege and with all humility, the opportunity to work and be mentored by Thandika Mkandawire, just like many of us, when I served as Deputy Executive Secretary for Publications at CODESRIA under him. In fact, my affectionate name and title for him, as Professor Jimi Adesina and Dr. Godwin Murunga might well remember, was Mboss. He was a combination of intensely serious academic work and also an immense joie de vivre. He brought rigor and joy together. in spite of the serious challenges we faced as Africans. And he made sure that those of us who worked with him also benefited from his endless optimism about the possibilities of our Africanness, that through hard work, through collaboration, through the correct political action and collective movement building, we all can contribute to the transformation of this continent of ours. Before I go into the lecture will not be complete if I fail to acknowledge some of the lesser-known contributions of Professor Thandika Mkandawire to the higher education terrain in Africa. Professor Adesina and Dr. Murunga have already mentioned some of them, particularly the fact that he was an institution builder. But a greater point that we need to know was the fact that he was a man of supreme commitment, and he contributed as much as possible to beyond CODESRIA. He was responsible for endless attention to the strengthening of the faculties and centers for the social sciences in Africa. We need to remember that CODESRIA started off as a council of deans and directors of faculty of social sciences in Africa, and Thandika never forgot that. Thandika always made sure that he was committed and concerned with what was going on in that original constituency of CODESRIA. Thandika and CODESRIA also inaugurated the small grants program for master's and doctoral dissertations in Africa at a time when there was very little opportunity for African scholars, particularly younger African scholars and emerging scholars, to have some resource to be able to complete their doctoral studies. He established with CODESRIA perhaps the most vibrant academic publishing in Africa, with a flagship journal, Africa Development, and supported other journals, establishing other journals in African history, sociology, and higher education. The publications program, which I had the privilege of managing over a period of time, also produced an impressive number of books across disciplines and from many generations of thematic and regional and national research networks. Beginning with Thandika, CODESRIA launched extensive early academic career capacity development and training institutes, such as the Governance Institute that Godwin referred to, the Gender Institute, and several other institutes. Thandika also, we must remember, was absolutely and completely committed to academic freedom in Africa. In fact, CODESRIA itself was seen as a space of academic freedom, not only from the emancipation from the domination of our leaders, but emancipation from externally imported knowledge that were not contributing to the real transformation of Africa. CODESRIA was a space where Africans could go and be free to really do the work as they see, not guided by any other person's agenda. There was also, of course, a very significant one, and somebody reminded me from the Center for Basic Research in Uganda a couple of days ago when Godwin announced, I think on Twitter, this lecture. Thandika contributed to the establishment of regional independent research centers, such as the Center for Basic Research in Kampala. He supported the Arab Research Center in Cairo, Egypt, and of course the SAPES Trust in Harare, Zimbabwe. And of course, there was that commitment to the intergenerational development of scholarship on the continent. He paid attention to emerging scholars. You can witness that in his famous article on 3 generations of social sciences in Africa. But he's also paid significant attention to senior scholars in terms of providing the space for them in the Reflections on Development program that initiated amazing products that were path-breaking and paradigm-shifting on African development. Professor Jimi Adesina labor in the explanation of, I can't fully remember, the title of your famous book was a product of that. I think labor in the, I will seek your kind permission for you to write the correct title in the text part of this presentation. Thus, in my estimation, Thandika Mkandawire was a foremost pioneer, a visionary leader, and strong bearer of the principles and norms that help shape the trajectory and landscape of the social sciences and humanities, and consequently higher education in Africa. Indeed, if anyone valued, that is, placed the highest premium on higher education as a tool for emancipation from poverty, ignorance, and disease in Africa, if anyone stood on unshakable moral belief and the highest degree of integrity on academic freedom and the autonomous capacity of African academics and intellectuals to individually and collectively design and choose both their research agendas and larger intellectual projects, and finally, if anyone carried and promoted a long-term visionary perspective of the alignment of education with Africa's transformation, that one person was Boss Thandika Mkandawire. It is partly in recognition of the importance of the elements of vision, value, and values in Thandika's remarkable contributions to African higher education that I've chosen in this lecture to interrogate these three elements in the transformation of higher education in Africa. The attempt here is not to ignore or demean other factors that come into play, such as the nature of access, success, inclusion, human capital, financing, and infrastructure in higher education in Africa, but rather to provoke a reconsideration of these elements that are often neglected in our discourses so far. Vision, value, and the values that we bring to imagining, engaging, and intervening in African higher education belong to what I will call the DNA, or in some ways, the software qualities and assets essential to building the institutions, the infrastructure, practices, and norms that form the higher education ecosystem in Africa. In many ways, they drive both leadership and imagination, and constitute the source for the mobilization and deployment of the hardware that we need to confront the intractable and perhaps wicked problems in the sense of retail and verbal of 1973, of higher education, and perhaps politics and development in Africa. I must also confess that before beginning to work on this lecture, I went back to some of my own work on higher education in Africa. Some of this started with work dating back to 3 decades ago, and others that are more recent I also reviewed. I also reviewed some contemporary material, and I was struck by the high degree of Afro-pessimism that characterized the discourse on higher education in Africa. I remember Mboss was always a critique of Afro-pessimism in our scholarship and in our development thinking. It is a discourse that is permeated with an endless sense of impending doom and is very much stuck in the reactions and responses to the damages that the neoliberal policies of the structural adjustment interventions of the 1980s and 1990s had wreaked on higher education in Africa. I want to submit that we have come some significant distance in the reworking of higher education systems, processes, and terrain in Africa since the 1980s and early 1990s. We have not come far enough, but we have shifted the needle in a more positive direction that acknowledges our agency, our imagination, and our striving as Africans in beginning not only to define our perspectives and approaches to higher education, but also our reimagining and reconfiguring of the higher education landscape. The very presence that this is being organized by SARChI and being organized by CODESRIA is actually an affirmation of the point that I'm making. Of course, we still have some distance to go. We're not static. Some more work to reclaim our agency and autonomy, particularly in identifying and defining what is relevant and what is fit for ourselves and our societies and economies. This is where I come back to my organizing theme today of vision, value, and values in the task ahead of us. And it is where the legacy of our pioneer innovators in higher education, such as Thandika Mkandawire, Abdullah Bujra, Samir Amin, Thomas Odiambo, in STEM, and T.A. Lambo in psychiatry, and many more. And also our nationalist leaders. Some of our nationalist leaders become important. Let us examine each of these elements, interrogate how they connect with the transformation of higher education in Africa and the challenges and opportunities lodged in experiences with them, or how they have been expressed. However, before I begin to explore these three elements, I would like to share some thoughts on higher education and the university in Africa, and why I believe it could do with a strong injection of reflection from the perspectives of these points, of these pillars. First, it is important to note that higher education, like all pillars of our economy and society, is neither neutral nor innocent, because it imbues skills and status, and of course the making of meaning, and the accompanying privileges and compensation to members of society. It is a contestable field, and a phenomenon that vested interests seek to control and determine not only its direction, but who gets access and how it is used and deployed. As I pointed out in the previous work, higher education contributes to the formation and deployment of human capital, the cultural and social construction of values and meaning, and the capacity for individual and collective emancipation from ignorance and domination. It further contributes to how the energies and products of science, technology, and the improvement, science and technology, and the improvement of material conditions are mobilized for the well-being of individuals and groups. It provides the people with the tools and capacities for their collective and individual self-definition and empowerment, and for interpreting their relationships to themselves, to others, and to nature and their material and other environments. In other words, it is an essentially political and contested domain. We see it more clearly in our current times, that is witnessing the return of authoritarian politics, denial of science, and the struggles to control life-determining technologies. Such a resource is important for national and collective self-determination. Higher education and its outcomes cannot be permanently outsourced without the risk of strategic loss of autonomy, self-determination, and the loss of people's collective material and other well-being. My understanding is that Thandika and Mkandawire and some of our pioneer innovators understood this very well. The rest of this lecture is in 4 parts. 3 of these interrogate and connect the key elements of the 3 V's: vision, value, and values, while the 4th part is what I call the unfinished business of higher education in Africa. Let's start with vision. Vision refers to the possession and application of a long-range lens in the viewing, engaging, understanding, and solutioning of an issue, problem, or phenomena. It involves the ability to imagine alternative states that are not yet in place, but are desired and desirable. Vision can be constitutive, integrative, and holistic. In other cases, it can be partial and fragmentary. Vision has often determined the intellectual and other mission of higher education institutions. We have seen this with the actions of some of the nationalist founders in Africa. And Thandika actually did write about the nationalist founders in Africa, both in terms of their vision and their pathways to development, such as Kwame Nkrumah, Mwalimu Nyerere, Obafemi Awolowo, Nnamdi Azikiwe, Kenneth Kaunda. Some of these founded new national universities or adapted the mission of the inherited colonial universities to their nationalist, post-colonial, and Pan-Africanist vision. For instance, a clear Pan-African intellectually and materially emancipatory vision was elucidated in Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's speech titled The African Genius, delivered on 25th October 1963 at the opening of the Institute of African Studies of the University of Ghana. The 5 questions that Nkrumah asked about relevance, about alignment with the economy and national goals, and about transformation are all still relevant today in Africa and to higher education in Africa. This was vision at the grand macro level. also demonstrated by Mwalimu Nyerere in his position on education for self-reliance in Tanzania, and Obafemi Awolowo in his reflection on path to Nigerian freedom, and Nnamdi Azikiwe in the setting up of what used to be known as the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. We have seen also the contributions of pioneer innovators like Thandika Mkandawire, Abdallah Bujra, and Samir Amin in the creation of social science institutions. We also have examples of this in Dr. Tom Odiambo's pioneering work in helping to found the African Academy of Sciences and his early work at ICIPI, the International Center for Insect and Plant Ecology. So vision has been an element of the work of the pioneers, of the innovators in African higher education. But perhaps what we are seeing in a more contemporary era in terms of the confrontation of the challenges of higher education in Africa are the experimentation and institutional innovations built by African leaders with a vision. I was having a conversation with Professor Funmiyola Onishakin about 2 days ago on leadership on the continent. And we thought what came out was what we would call the random distribution of leadership at different nodes and institutions across the continent. And that the fact that you manage through whatever means to get to political power at the top does not significantly constitute you as a transformative leader. It has never done anyway. There are millions and hundreds of thousands of transformative leaders in different nodes. And this is what we are seeing. We're seeing this in the creation of new universities such as Ashesi University and African Leadership University. We're seeing this in higher education networks across the disciplines. I will not want to bore you with some of the names of some of them. In new modes of program delivery in faculties, centers of excellence, institutes and disciplinary and multidisciplinary collaborations and associations. I don't want to embarrass you, Professor Jimi Adesina, but the SARChI chair actually has demonstrated some vision and new models, innovation in doctoral production and in relationship between students and academics. We're also seeing that in some of the work being done at WITS. We're seeing that in some of the networks of CODESRIA, the networks of ICP, the networks of the Science Foundation for Africa, the networks of the African Academy of Sciences. We are beginning to see actually amazing work coming out that we did not see 30 years ago. Genome sequencing is being carried out in our universities, at least 2 or 3 centers. We are beginning to see scientific products in material sciences and engineering that are competitive. What we have not seen is the movement, the commercialization of some of these products, and that's more related to the nature of the global political economy and the role of businesses, and actually a lack of vision from our own political leaders in terms of the way they envisage our economies. So I would like to say very quickly about the biggest challenge of vision in Africa today will remain and is resourcing and sustainability in terms of the viable resources such as funding to grow, reproduce, and institutionalize the very many nodes of vision. In a lot of cases, our vision-driven success stories have been supported mainly by external funding and resources. The time to begin to source and mobilize internally generated resources and funding is here and now. And although it is difficult, cracking this nut will be a significant opportunity. Again, in terms of some of the work that is being done by some of our centers for philanthropy, we are beginning to see what I'll call a gradual crossover, in which our so-called high net worth individuals are establishing foundations. Some of them are also establishing higher education institutions. And what I would like to say is the famous word that those who is not against us is for us. We hope that the creation and the investments across the board, either in state and local universities or regional universities, or in private universities, or even in public universities, in centers of engineering, centers and various other centers for humanities and social sciences. All of them will contribute. They all come from a visionary perspective. They come from the recognition and the need to redeploy resources. But that challenge still remains for us. And of course, the opportunity is for us to tap what it is that we have on the continent more than what it is that comes from outside. I'll go now to the notion of value, because I think it's important. The notion of value today is mostly demonstrated in economic, business, financial, and commercial terms. We actually live in a world where there's a proliferation of the notion and use of values. Value. We hear of value chains, we hear of value proposition, we hear of value for money, and we hear of fair market value as part of our routine day-to-day discussions. Mariana Mazzucato, in her 2018 book, The Value of Everything, Making and Taking in the Global Economy, has provided us with extensive examination and demystification of the ideology, practices, and knowledge behind the rise and dominance of the notion. And she has actually related it to the growth of financialization. But the understanding in this lecture is that value is found in all sectors. Beyond value is not only located in the economy. It is actually the premium we place on a subject, an object, a relationship, or a phenomenon. How we estimate it and how we prioritize it, and how much it matters to us in our scales of preferences and choices. How we value is often expressed in our decision making, and we ascribe measures to what we value, either through money, other material components, or from our cultural norms and emotional or religious orientation. Thus, if our cultures, faith, and maybe politics allow us or define what we place equal premium, that we place equal premium on all human beings, irrespective of gender, sex, status, ethnicity, race, or color, we are most likely to be more inclusive in our practices, actions, and policies. Because we value equality, we value integration. The same applies to the value we ascribe to higher education in the development trajectories of our nations. In fact, it's very interesting that there was a time when, as Africans, we were told that the return on investment in primary education is greater than that of higher education, and therefore we should place greater value on primary education, which means then that we outsource our thinking and our strategic thinking, our innovation, our experimentation at the highest level to others, and remain at the level of just the producers of factory hands. But then this is not to demean the importance of workers or working class culture or working class operations, but it's to see that in the International Division of Labor, some people had placed a greater value on us not being able to think for ourselves, not being able to develop critical modes of thinking. So since value is generally seen in monetary terms in our world today, and we operate with a scarcity mentality, higher education in Africa has been approached by most of our leaders from the point of view of choices between scarce resources, not from a perspective of visionary transformation of society for the collective good. More significantly, leaders have placed greater premium on military spending, prestige infrastructure projects, and opulent personal lifestyle than on education, the inclusion of women, or gender equity. Most of the private jets, the yachts and the boats, the presidential boats and yachts, a lot of them most probably could pay for maybe tens of thousands of students in secondary school or in the university or in tertiary institutions over a period of time. So whether this negative placement of premium on what translates into choices that benefits the majority is a result of lack of commitment or understanding or derives from negative cultural norms requires more interrogation. But it is obviously related to a lack of transformative vision. The challenge here is that in a predominantly monetized society, valuing has created transactional short-term perspectives and actions. The opportunity here is that there's the realization that this is contributing to significant trust deficits and increased polarization in society and the economy, and is therefore unsustainable. Another opportunity has also emerged with regards to value. I want to bring us to another part of this notion and commitment to value and valuing. Another opportunity that emerged more significantly in the post-COVID era is the espousal of some market orientation by the new innovators and entrepreneurial founders of an increasing number of African universities. These, by focusing on the employability of their graduates, are offering new narrative about value for money in their university programs delivery. Somehow, they are also placing value on the student as the recipient and user of learning. They see their students maybe as customers. You might disagree with this perspective, but it is a notion of valuing in higher education. And therefore, they believe that if their students are customers, they are there to provide services to them. And therefore, they actually incidentally value the student and the learner more than some of our old public universities that have lost a grasp of both vision and of value in terms of the value of the student as a key player within the university. There are students also in some of these new private universities and new ventures, and some of the public universities are being trained to have skills not only for the job markets, but also for its growth areas, such as the digital economy and sectors that are more integrated into the global economy, such as finance, climate science, or areas that require transnational or immigrant talent and human capital, such as health and the care industries. Here, I am not ascribing a normative position. I am providing a descriptive analysis of the trend. Finally, let's come to values. Values from a sociological perspective refers to what societies determine as the right or good thing or proper thing to do. They often derive from the norms and, in certain cases, the ethical foundations of a society. Sociologists have often seen values as what holds society together, that is, the substance of social integration and determinants of community. This is very different from a market conceptualization of values in terms of supply and demand. Values, in fact, I saw an interesting measurement of social value the other day in one of the Stanford journals for social innovation. And I realized that this was not values as I understood it, because it was talking about the market determinant of social values. Values are the basis of what others might call individual and collective principles, what one believes in and stands for, and how they are and they are related to how we conceive of standards of integrity, dignity, commitment, and engagement. In the case of the 3 points of interest here, vision, value, and values, it is values that drive commitment to equality. Values drive commitment to inclusivity. Values drive commitment to free speech, to democracy, and to academic freedom. Such values help to determine behavior, the choices and decisions we make. Again, there were moments in the nationalist era when visionary leaders endeavored to grow good citizenship, love of country and patriotism, service to others, and giving back to societies. Values were once inherent in the construction of the mission of universities in Africa by the nationalist leader, but they faded in the drive towards massification and the devaluation of higher education that occurred with the neoliberal structural adjustment era and the breakdown of the nationalist consensus in many African countries and also the erosion of trust between citizens and leaders created by the large-scale corruption of public office holders and the failure of the state to deliver on public goods and services. Today, we are beginning to see the return of values-based delivery of higher education. This is happening in some of the public universities. It is returning in the faith-based universities and in secular forms in some universities such as SARChI University and African Leadership University and a couple of some of the new ones. Values are regaining a premium in the founding of higher education, the formation of students, and in terms of research ethics and business and scholarly practices. However, this is happening in contexts in which a lot of our larger society and economy in many African countries are going through all forms of crisis and tension, and in certain cases going through what sociologists will call states of anomie. What we are seeing, though, is that the restoration of values and principles of renewal, service, and giving back is an opportunity to transform what higher education in Africa is and will become. However, all of these are operating in the context of what I will now like to identify as 4 unfinished business of higher education transformation in Africa. In spite of the progress of higher education in Africa, there are some core issues that require investment of all resources to ensure sustainability and viability, not only of the competitiveness and relevance of the higher education institutions, but also the alignment or realignment of higher education mission to some of the significant changes in our political economies and the recognition of the right thing to do, the recognition of a values-driven reconstruction and reimagination of the mission of universities. First, there's the unfinished business of high-quality talent in African higher education. Higher education institutions need to reproduce themselves in competitive, viable, and sustainable ways. We have a challenge of building the human capital to teach, to carry out research and development and innovation, and manage the institutions in ways that make them relevant, fit for the epochs we are in, and are able to build and manage transformation of the future. This will require investing in and an acceleration of building the academy through new forms of doctorate development and high-quality managers. We have to move from the colonial and aristocratic practices of the production of the PhD to new forms of accelerating high-quality, excellent doctoral graduates who will become the leader of our academies in the future. The second unfinished business relates to equity and inclusivity in African higher education institutions. We spent the past 5 decades talking about gender equity. We made some investment and some progress, but there's still a greater need for further investment in women's leadership in the academy and the greater inclusion of women and other marginalized groups in terms of access and success in higher education, particularly in those areas that are actually the most competitive in the economy. The third unfinished business is greater and more significant integration into the 4th industrial revolution through an acceleration of all relevant disciplines, processes, and knowledges that drive innovation, that drive integration. And in this case, we must not forget indigenous knowledges. As we talk about digital technologies, climate sciences, nanotechnology, digital humanities, we talk about folklore, and all the various new developments in medicine, health and pandemic and other sciences, we must remember the integration of indigenous knowledges. We must remember that we're at a point in history where we can actually leapfrog as a continent, where some of the investments that have been made in other forms of industrial revolutions as infrastructure are actually outmoded and being renewed. So we have a good opportunity at this point to create new forms of organizing knowledge, new forms of co-creation, greater exposure and willingness to embrace new paradigms and epistemologies, and to actually create new forms of significantly collaborating and sharing of resources and services across geographies and locales by higher education institutions. We must rethink the way universities collaborate and work with each other, collaborate and work with other sectors of society, collaborate and work in communities if we are to succeed in transforming our societies and economies. And the fourth and final unfinished business is bringing back the student and the learner into the center of learning, of higher education learning. Maybe we inherited different forms of universities in the colonial university systems and the colonial mission, particularly the old German research universities, in terms of the professors who profess from a pillar or a stage in which there's almost a moat between the professor and the students. It is not an interactive process. It's not a process that privileges the student, but privileges learning in an abstract form. Maybe this is the time to go beyond that. We need to recenter student-based and learner-based orientation in our higher education systems in terms of pedagogy, administration, welfare, and the recognition that people are our most important resource in Africa. And when we talk about democratization and decolonization, we must decolonize our councils. We must decolonize our senates. We must decolonize our faculties. We must decolonize our pedagogies. And all of that means recognizing what we have as inherent local resources, what we have as the basis of modes of organizing and self-organizing that are not built on certain aristocratic, feudalistic, and non-egalitarian forms. African students are an important pool of vested interests. Our universities must operate in alignment with their needs, their aspirations, and their struggles. These four unfinished businesses will require resources, energy, and commitment. Of course, they will require vision, value, and values that Thandika and Mkandawire demonstrated in his life and his life work, and which are the necessary foundations for our transformation. Ladies and gentlemen, organizers, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to give this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tade Aina, for what to me is a very an intensely inspiring engagement on this topic. I think it's Jimi Adesina who started by pointing out how intensely interdisciplinary Professor Thandika Mkandawire was. And as your boss, I think you learned very well from his. This is indeed a very useful exploration on the theme of higher education, but from a vantage point that not very many of us who engage in these things have paid attention to. So I want to thank you very much for the provocative intervention, for the manner in which it expands our horizons of thinking around the challenge of higher education in contemporary Africa, but also most importantly, for the manner in which it pulls together trends from economics, from sociology, from higher education itself as a discipline, but also generally from political economy, but in a way that is not reductionist, in a way that allows us to begin to open new ways of thinking around the question of the major challenges that higher education sector faces in Africa. I am indeed very excited that you brought together the 3 V's in a way that speaks to the area of higher education on contemporary Africa. You will recall many years ago when you were at the Ford Foundation, we were all thinking about the contribution of the 4 foundations in the context of the Partnership for Higher Education. And we were worrying about a slightly different set of issues. For me, I think you have opened up a pathway to asking ourselves new questions around where to place the transformatory thrust for the sector going forward, especially in the final 4 unfinished businesses that you have put on the table, putting together not just the question of alignment to values equity in relation to the point on gender, but also I think that your last point around bringing back the students is a generational question that you are putting on the table. And perhaps for me, asking newer questions about the what one would call the demographics of the university today and how they relate to that sector. I think that we have some time for Q&A, some engagement on this, and I am not sure if the technical team is able to allow a few of the participants to raise questions. I think there are 2 major options for doing this. One would be through the chat, and I am happy to pick out a few of those when they come for a Q&A. But I think we can allow a few people to intervene. I want to find out from Professor Jimi Adesina if there are any specific guidelines you want to give the colleagues attending on this before we go to some of the questions that I can identify from the system. Jimi?
Yeah, no, I think, there's some hands already, a couple of hands already. We can take those ones and then go to the, some of the questions already on the chat.
Okay. Unfortunately, on my side, I cannot see. I can see someone called Maza.
Malik Maza, Professor Malik Maza.
Professor Malik Maza, please, do you want to go?
Yes. Yes. Good evening, colleagues. First of all, I wish to express my deepest gratitude to the speaker, Professor Tade Aina, for this comprehensive presentation indeed. I am not in the field of the professor and that speech. What is sure is that I have understood that one is a remark, the other one is a question to Prof. The first one is I'm really puzzled that in effect the late Mkandawire was one of the architects of ECP. Is it correct?
No, it's not Mkandawire. It's the person I was talking about was one of the founders of ECP was Dr. the Kenyan, who was the founder of the African Academy.
Professor Tom Odiambo.
Yes.
Odiambo.
Yes.
Thank you.
He was one of the one of our pioneer intellectual institution builders, like Professor Mkandawire. I mentioned his name in relation to such other leaders.
Thank you. Prof, my question is the following. You have mentioned that our society is now 4th industrial revolution driven and innovation are coming. In effect, the innovation are moving extremely very fast. Do you think, Prof, that there is a space for both for the university to be an innovation hub, and so therefore to create an entrepreneurship type wave for the workforce of tomorrow, as well as the university will still be the somehow the component of academic freedom and knowledge generation. What do you think about this, Prof? What are your thoughts about these two supposedly bipolar or opposite approaches of how to produce the workforce of tomorrow, either entrepreneur oriented, science for social impact, or knowledge production? Thank you.
Dr. Murunga, can I take that very quickly? Yes, we talked about universities going beyond themselves. I'll give you two illustrations. In terms of, I am not sure how up to date now. In terms of innovation hubs in Africa, we have them located, significant innovation hubs, particularly with regards to digital innovations, are located significantly in Nairobi, Lagos, and I think in parts of South Africa, and in North Africa, Morocco, Tunisia. One of the critical problems I have faced with the understanding of the development of the private innovation hubs, particularly in Nairobi and Lagos, is that they are both located within driving or at times walking distances of the university. The Yaba Innovation Hub in Lagos, the concentration of innovative activities in the digital technologies, is only a walking distance from the University of Lagos. The university is only connected through the production of the graduates, but not in any other organic way. The innovation hubs, in terms of investments, in terms of activities, in terms of physical spaces, you do not find them. Unlike what we find if you look at the Oxford, Oxford, UK, the kind of concentration of hubs, or you look at it in California, or you look at it in the Cambridge River area, in the Boston River area. It is important now that our universities must look beyond their gates and their walls and connect with real-life activities happening in the economy, and particularly in the areas of the digital economy and digital technologies. Connect with the investors, connect with the practitioners, connect with the learners, who are actually, a lot of them are self-trained, autodidact, or they are trained by access to things like YouTube and other forms of digital tools that they find online. So that is a challenge for university leadership. That's a challenge for university management. And that's a challenge for university lecturers themselves. Some universities are creating innovation hubs. I think USIU was thinking of an industrial park in Nairobi. But beyond that, I think the Obafemi Awolowo University had an old conventional industrial park. But these are new ways of doing things, and we must connect in a very rapid way with what is going on out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
Okay, there's on the Q&A, Laura Mann. Maybe
Jimmy.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jimmy. Can I ask Laura to speak to her question, because it might come back out better if you ask the question directly than if we read it for you in the chat.
Yes.
Laura, please.
I think the person needs to raise their hands first so that we can unmute them.
That's Laura Mann.
Okay, okay. Let's see. Okay, it's fine.
Okay. Laura, can you now?
I think I can see.
Can you please unmute?
Laura,
I can see the question is in the Q&A.
Okay, do you want to respond to the question, Prof?
Yes, I thank you very much, Laura, and good to have you on. I know you work closely with Mwalimu Thandika Mkandawire, and both of us talked about his influence on our lives. So it's good to have you here. I think the challenge of commercializing and capturing economic value by African universities is a significant challenge. And it's actually where the elements of vision has to come in a way in which I'm struggling with how to put this, because I'm seeing younger, newer universities doing this better than others, either in terms of access to intellectual properties, patenting, moving to design prototypes, and and this is not, it's not a question of regional dispersal. It's actually a question of the challenge between the mentalities and the values and the ways of thinking and acting, particularly in our older public universities versus the younger, more entrepreneurial universities. That is the kind of variance I'll talk about. The variance is first the type of universities, the age of the universities, the leadership, and the orientation of the universities. There's still the traditional mission, the three traditional missions, but there's a new kind of ways in which more prototypes could be developed, more engagement with the private sector, with business, with communities. Because if you're looking at transformation in agri-food systems, Africa is still predominantly a peasant agricultural economy. And the connections with making the lives of the people different in terms of how do you help them develop tools, processes, ideas, ways of working, ways of selling, ways of storage that can transform their lives? And how do you actually commercialize that in a way that is accessible, both in terms of costs? That is a challenge, and it's going to be I think it's also a challenge of leadership, and it's a challenge of visionary leadership. Because if there's a leader that thinks that we should break the barriers and cross the boundaries between the academy and the economy and the communities, then this will happen. So far, I've seen interesting efforts. Again, I'll go back to Redeemers University and some of the work they are doing. I'll go back to some of the work that's ongoing in parts of universities in Ghana. I'll go back to some of the works ongoing with some of the universities. Again, is the newer generation, second or third or fourth generation universities that are really, really reaching out more than the old conventional universities that are still very much stuck in their ways and are still also overwhelmed by the demand of teaching with inadequate, insufficient resources.
Prof, there is also another question in the chat which I would like you to attempt. I think it's Bet. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing the name properly. He says, if we talk about vision, we must also consider the sociology of higher education. Participation in higher education in Africa is still far below that in the global north. We must take into account that higher education will face a major expansion in Africa. Can we briefly consider what this may mean for medium of instruction? Is also relevant in connection to indigenous knowledge. What is going to be the role of indigenous African languages and their use in science?
Yeah, that is interesting because there are actually innovations and practices occurring in terms of scaling up access. A good example I'll give you is the African Leadership University. It is the most unconventional kind of university in terms of the delivery of lectures, in terms of the emphasis on peer learning, in terms of rapid, the acceleration of access. It is a university, I think, in terms of its own goal, is ready to produce 300,000 graduates in the next couple of years. It has 2 campuses, I think, and and I hope I'm right. I think it has a campus in Mauritius and a campus in Rwanda, but it has learning centers based on a blended system of delivery. At least across, there are 90 learning centers, and I hear the plan is to accelerate to 300 learning centers of rapid access that you need. But it's also, it's a combination also of what you might call a combination of a little bit of what you might call the conventional liberal arts, humanities elements that are the basic reading with essential essential orientation towards digital technologies, digital skills, software engineering, and of course, business and finance. That is one example. That is one experimentation. There are other kinds of experimentation occurring with actually university collaboratives. One university in Africa cannot do. We cannot use the old global north model of single universities. It has to be a collaboration of universities around disciplines, around thematic areas, in terms of the development of both undergraduates and graduates in various areas. And that's where there has to be a new kind of thinking, a new kind of visioning. So that, I think, is the challenge. That kind of work is already beginning. It needs to be scaled up. I know the African Leadership University is actually beginning to scale that up with another version of it known as the ALX. So that is one experimentation that is going on. And it's Pan-African. It's across different geographies. And I think we need many more. And that's been published in their experience, and that of Ashesi has been published in the book on the new global universities, in which there are different experimentation with how to organize and deliver beyond the old conventional modes of university delivery. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Olayinka, are you able to speak? Can we unmute Olayinka's mic? I noticed you have a question in the chat, but maybe you want to elaborate on your question. Can we hear from you? I can also, Marion has a question in the chat. If we can't unmute Olayinka, I think I can read the question, Prof. What should be the attitude of African universities relative to global universities ranking? What should be the attitude of African universities relative to global universities ranking? Prof, as you respond to that, can I ask the technical team to see if they can unmute Marion? I think it's Marion Ouma.
I think there's already an African response. There's the African Universities Collaborative, led by Ashesi, with about 115 other universities that have actually worked in developing an African ranking and rating system that is not actually completely defined, but also to some extent responsive to the global ranking. And I think they've done that with Times Higher Education series, and it's been used. So if you actually go Google the African Higher Education Collaborative, is led by Ashesi University, working with several other African universities to say, how do we rank ourselves, in which other factors as actually the readiness for work is part of it, the understanding, there's a whole different, they develop that themselves. So I think it's important to, I think it's important to recognize, like I said in the lecture, we are not stuck in the past anymore. There's been a lot of agency among African universities. It's just that we have a longer way to go. But I think the biggest challenge we're going to have in thinking about decolonization or what of African higher education is how do we let go of some of the old colonial approaches, even in the laws of universities, in the fact of the nature, particularly for public universities, the relationship with the visitor, with the chancellor, with the governments, the laws that say you need 50 acres of land to set up a university. I think there's the need for regulation, but there's the need for tremendous innovation in how universities are reorganized and reconfigured, and how we also begin to collaborate and partner with each other in terms of quality assurance and quality enhancement. All of that is wide open, and I don't think there are hard and fast rules. I do not want to say because we are African universities that we should have just Africans, so-called African standards that get to ICSAS in terms of standards of excellence in technology, scientific, or even humanistic production and co-production. But we must be able to insert into some of these things that are relevant to us and fit for purpose, but at the same time will enhance our competition, but also enhance inclusivity and equity within the context in which we live and work. And that in itself is a big challenge. It's a challenge of vision, it's a challenge of commitment, it's a challenge of organizing, bringing us together. I want to add something. We cannot leave universities, either public or private, on their own. We've had civil society for various other things, for public provisioning and all of that. It is high time that we develop a civil society for higher education in Africa that pays attention to higher education, that demands accountability, that demands transparency, that demands new forms of organizing.
Thank you, Prof. Marion, I hope your mic is unmuted.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm in a noisy place, so I'm not sure you're able to hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Aina, for the mind-provoking lecture in honor of Professor Thandika Mkandawire. My question is, what do you think is going to be the effect of what currently looks like a continuation and a revival of structural adjustment programs on higher education? And what in your view, do you think is going to be the effect, especially when we think about Africa being in a much more globalized world and globalized economy than when we had structural adjustments 30 years ago? Thank you.
The structural, thank you very much. We're talking about neoliberalization. We are talking about the queering of the deployment of resources for higher education, particularly state-owned public sector. I think actually the challenge of public universities actually begins with their ability to have autonomy and organizational agency to be able to do their things, to mobilize resources. I gave a lecture at the 50th anniversary of the University of Dar es Salaam, and I raised a question. When you look at our public universities, particularly our urban public universities, they are sitting on some of the most amazing assets you can think of. These assets are what I'll call colonial and immediate post-colonial endowments in terms of land, location, and again, we come back to vision. But in relation to vision, we also come back to regulation and control and domination by the states themselves. If these universities develop new forms of accountability in terms of their governance, if these universities recognize that they are actually operating in dynamic economies and they have the autonomy to determine where to go in terms of converting the assets they have into resources that are useful both for today and in perpetuity, I think they have the opportunity for a change in that sense. So I think that's one thing. I think globally, most universities, it is a difficult time to be in the university in the world today, in many ways, in this era of polarization, in this era of the pressure, particularly on public universities and state across the board. And in this era in which some of our leadership would prefer to invest in private jets and private yachts than invest in transformative issues in higher education. But this is where I believe I think I stated there that higher education is political. It is not, it is political. And this is where we need to begin to rethink how we organize around the value of higher education in our societies and our economies in terms of access, in terms of success, in terms of the role it plays in transforming our societies and our productive resources. And I think that's something that is missing. We are not recognizing enough the importance of the politics of higher education, even at the local and national context. And we have to reclaim that.
I think I saw Ndriesi Lumumba's hand raised. Can we unmute her mic?
Can you repeat the name?
Ndriesi Lumumba.
Prof, we did unmute her and then she disappeared again, so I'm not sure if she's back on.
Prof, there is a question a comment, I think, in the chat that you might want to respond to from Verok. Thank you so much for the thought-provoking and interesting lecture. It still hurts that the wishes of the pioneers of Professor Mkandawire and others such as Nyerere and Nkrumah still seem far-fetched. It appears we are like in a vicious cycle, and this time 60 years plus after colonization, it is partly questionable whether we can still blame colonialism fully for our predicament in African universities. The question of willingness has been raised by Professor Tade, but are the current leaders in African universities and political leaders willing? Is there hope for the future African university?
I am an African, and I do not subscribe to Afro-pessimism, because if we did, we will not have existed. If you look at the various experiences from slavery to colonization, the African person will have ceased to exist if there is no driving optimism that has created the resilience and the survival and definitely the thriving that will be ours if we continue. So for me, basically, I'm coming from, I do not want to have a compromise with African pessimism. The future of African university is being constructed and reconstructed. It is actually socially constructed. There are examples, there are pools, but there are significant political elements. And colonization is not an episode like Ade Ajayi said in African history. It's actually almost a genetic transmutation that needs to be poached and poached and poached. Is in structures, is in the wigs and the robes that lawyers wear when they come to court in a tropical area. It's in the citations, both in religious books, in legal precedents, in the way we set up the courts, the assizes, the Supreme Court, our university convocations, the title of deans and provosts and chancellors or vice chancellors. So let's be clear about the very ways colonization has been woven into our DNA that needs a significant purging. So I actually shudder when people think, oh, colonization has stopped. Colonization. What we are seeing with the role of mining companies in DRC. There are so many things that show that our past has not totally left us. So let's be clear. Let's have that kind of historical perspective as we challenge some of the conditions in which we exist. But let's then take our own agency, because the structures are not perpetually determining. Human agents can change structure if they organize and mobilize. And I'm surprised that nobody has actually reacted to the fact about what I talked about, the civil society or the social movements for change in African higher education, in African education. The reorganizing around that in itself will actually be politically earth-shattering, of access to every child to primary education, every girl to primary education, to secondary education. If we even just reorganize around those issues alone, you will see the pressure we will put on our dominant leaders on the continent. So I feel whenever I hear people to say, oh no, we don't have Lord Lugard anymore, we don't have colonization anymore, that is actually a fundamental misunderstanding of the way history works and in a way in which structural dynamics reproduce themselves. Both in the structures themselves, in our perception and perspectives, and in our mentalities. So it's a long haul. It's just like even when you look at feminist emancipation, it's a long haul. It's a long walk to freedom, as Nelson Mandela said in his biography.
Thanks, Prof. I'm going to give one last question. I think that I can see Ndriya Lumumba is back online. Are you unmuted? Ndri? Otherwise, I have one last question in the chat that I wanted to read out. Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Tade, Akin, Aina. I would like to ask two questions. What is your perspective on the circulation and dissemination of scientific production among African universities? What paths do you see?
Two things. I talked about the difference between 15 years ago, 2009, and today, in terms of the growth of networks in the area. And actually very interesting also in terms of collaborations across countries, across continents. I think, like I said, we have increased in the number of scientific production, particularly more in the health sciences than in the other areas. But there are new networks emerging. I think the Science Foundation for Africa, the African Academy of Science, the work that is being done through ICP with PASET. I think there are significant efforts ongoing, and in the health sciences across the board, the various kind of collaboratives that are connected also to global northern universities around pandemic sciences, health sciences, genome sequencing. There's a lot going on. And you'll see that the concentration actually of the production is predominantly from South Africa, where there has been the investment in some of the infrastructure over the years. But I think these networks have a role. And some of these networks are actually being led by pioneer founders with what I'll call some degree of vision. The understanding, basically, is that African universities cannot remain in institutional silos. One university cannot do it, and we do not have the resources to create, out of the more than 1,500 universities we have now, about 1,500, to create 400 or 50 MITs or UCTs of its. We have to learn how to now share resources. We now have to learn how to build new platforms of collaboration across the various challenges that we face, either in science, in technology, in innovation, in engineering and material sciences. In fact, there's a lot of that. There's the ARISE program of the African Academy of Sciences that is also mobilizing. What we need to do is the increase in the production of scientific work. And that requires investment that is basically external at the moment, not enough from our countries. There was a commitment by our African governments to 1% of their resources in research and innovation many years ago. I don't think any one country has reached that level, I'm not sure. We need that commitment. So it's a question, it's not just about political will, it's about political mobilization. We can mobilize to demand the will, demand the action. We can mobilize. And that's where I've always been all my life. This is the activist element in the thinking around this. It's not, political will. That is an inert statement. We can lament about political will from here to kingdom come and nothing will change. But if we organize, and we've seen some examples recently in my dear Kenya, if we organize, we bring to people's attention immediately that this is important. And I think that is something. We do not know when the next pandemic is going to come. We do not know where it's going to come. We're not sure about our pandemic readiness. We're not sure. So we do need to hold our systems accountable, particularly our political and governance systems across the board, from universities to the larger political economies.
Okay, thank you, Prof, for that intervention. I think that your response around mobilizing to demand the political will does summarize for me two things that feature prominently in the discussions we've had. The first of those being not leaving higher education to educationists only. It's too important to be left to educationists only, and we need to expand the sphere of engagement with the higher education issues. You mentioned civil society. I think that we can expand that even beyond civil society into other areas that intersect with the higher education sector in very significant ways. The resource question is one of them. Agenda 2063 of the African Union identified higher education as an important area of investment. You are right. And I think that there is so much that is lagging. Many years after we held that major conference in Dakar, roughly 10 years ago. So I think that it's absolutely important that, but you have also, I think in this lecture, begun to rethink how to create an expanded and more vibrant higher education ecosystem beyond the university, beyond the councils, beyond the various institutions that we normally go to in thinking around the higher education. I think you are imagining a vibrant but broader ecosystem that will help not just deal with the challenges, move us from agonizing into organizing, but also I think more importantly, define the pathways, both in terms of dealing with the unfinished businesses, but also just defining in terms of vision where we want to go and how we want to go there. So Prof, I want to thank you most sincerely for this intervention and to hope that next year, Africa Development Volume 50, number 2, which should be published in June of 2025, will carry the text of your lecture. From the CODESRIA side, that is our commitment to not to carrying this beyond the audiovisual to the print version of the lecture. And I think that it promises to be an important path clearing intervention for where we want to go with the higher education sector. So on behalf of CODESRIA, I want to thank you very much and to ask Dr. Ilcheong, who is a senior program coordinator at UNRISD, to make some closing remarks.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm Ilcheong, Senior Research Coordinator at UNRISD, and thank you all for being here today as we gather to honor and remember the life and work of the late Thandika Mkandawire through various interventions, including Professor Tade Akin Aina's excellent lecture. And as a closing remark, I'd like to share with you some of my memories about late Thandika Mkandawire, who not only shaped my own academic journey and career path, but whose impact on the fields of development and social policy was more profound than anybody else. Thandika was a visionary, someone who deeply understood the interconnectedness of development and social policy. He believed that if he wanted to make real and lasting progress, these two areas of development policy and social policy should not exist in silos. For him, the link between development policy and social policy was not just a kind of a theoretical exercise. It was a necessary bridge linking intellectuals and policymakers working in different sectors. His vision was materialized in the form of innovative research projects of UNRISD with the concept of transformative social policy. This new approach did not just redefine social policy, it also clarified something fundamental, that is, development policies are for the people, and they should belong to the people. I'd like to share a small, interesting episode that captures Thandika's thought about development itself. It was October 2011, 13 years ago from today, and Thandika visited Korea, South Korea, and he gave a lecture at KOICA, the Korean Development Aid Agency. After the lecture, he had lunch with many trainees from African countries. During the meal, he asked one of the trainees about what she valued most about the training. And she talked about various exciting things about the training courses and lectures she attended. And listening to her, Thandika said, as always, yes, yes. Here, they don't tell you what to do. They tell you how they did it. And we need that kind of things from the advanced countries. That is the fundamental source for learning. Thandika's comment on the training and education in KOICA was very much aligned with his lifetime belief in mutual respect and partnership, not in top-down prescriptions. I still vividly remember how animated and engaged he became in that conversation with her, as if he had found the kind of a kindred spirit. It was one of those many moments that reflected his humility, his wisdom, and his deep respect for those he worked with, and at its core, the transformative social policy and the kind of revolutionary spirit. In fact, the transformative social policy was about expanding the boundaries of social policy and empowering the very people it was meant to serve. And his vision was not just about policy on paper, it was about giving people the tools, the ownership, and dignity they deserve. I think his legacy continues to inspire all of us who were fortunate enough to work alongside him, and his contributions to both academia and policy community will, without a doubt, shape our world for many years to come. I thank you, Professor Tade, Akin, Aina, for your excellent lecture, and all of those involved in organizing this Thandika Memorial Lecture, which is the institution of development discourses already. Thank you for listening, and thank you very much for all of you, all of yours participation in active discussion about development and our sustainable future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ilcheong. Apologies for mispronouncing your name earlier. Thank you for the reminders of the interesting ways in which Thandika interacted with us. Professor Jimi Adesina, please, vote of thanks.
Well, you know, on behalf of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, UNRISD, and the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRIA, and the South African Research Chair in Social Policy at the University of South Africa, I wish to express deep appreciation to all those who contributed to making today's event successful. In particular, I wish to thank the following people: Hanley Volhutas and Doc Mlambo of the College of Graduate Studies at the University of South Africa for their diligent efforts in organizing the event. Sheila Gitonga and Bashiru Wayne of the CODESRIA Secretariat for all their support and effort in organizing the event. Herman and Kwame, our interpreters. Professor Tennyson Gushini, the Executive Dean of the College of Graduate Studies, and Professor Tenjiwe Meyiwa, the UNISA Vice Principal for Research, Postgraduate Studies, Innovation and Commercialization, and the leadership of the college and the portfolio for the enduring support. Dr. Godwin Murunga, the CODESRIA Executive Secretary, Dr. Katja, Hujo, and Dr. Ilcheong at UNRISD for the enduring partnerships in honoring Thandika's memory and legacy. To Professor Tade, Akin, our keynote speaker, who enthusiastically accepted our invitation to deliver this year's memorial lecture for his brilliant lecture. Finally, I wish to thank all of you who attended today's memorial lecture. Thank you for your support in honoring Thandika's memory and legacy. We look forward to seeing you at the 2025 edition of the memorial lecture. Thank you all. Asante sana.
Thank you very much. I think that all that is left for me is to piggyback and thank all of us for attending this lecture, and hope to see you next year. To reiterate Jimi Adesina's point, otherwise, I wish you all a good evening, a good afternoon, wherever you are, and looking forward to hearing from you again. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye. Godwin, thank you very much.
No,